Hello again. Welcome to Astronomy Toronto. I'm your host. My name is Randy Attwood, and Astronomy Toronto is produced by the Toronto Centre of the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada. On the show Astronomy Toronto, we look at exactly what's going on in the sky above Toronto, astronomically speaking, but also what's going on in Toronto, what the members of the Toronto Centre are up to. Well, this spring, the spring of 1984, is going to be exceptionally good for looking at the planet Mars. Every 2 years or so, Mars gets nice and close to the Earth where we can see it in the sky, look at it through telescopes and get an idea of what's happening on this red planet. One of the experts in the Toronto Centre on Mars, is my friend Phil Mozel, who I guess, Phil, ever since I've known you, you've been interested in the planet Mars. And my first question is, why is Mars so interesting? Why has it always been a fascinating planet?
Well, it has a couple of reasons, really. It's intrinsically interesting as a planet other than our own planet Earth. Of all the other planets in the solar system, it is the one most like our own Earth, so we would like to know why it is that way and why it also is different. It also has something strange about it, not intrinsically but in our own minds. There's a whole mythology that has become built up around the planet and has prompted us really, I think, to explore out in space.
Well, it isn't the largest planet in the sky. It's actually smaller than the Earth, isn't it? And it's not the closest planet to Earth. That is Venus, being the closest. Well, why is it so special? Why have we always been interested in it?
Well, going back many, many years, people have thought that possibly there may be life on Mars. And although it is a fair distance away, it is not as far away as many of the other planets. And as I said, is possibly is Earth-like. Maybe we can reach out, contact these beings if they exist, and that would be a very exciting possibility.
One of the reasons I feel is that it has been difficult to really know what's going on in Mars is that when you look at Mars through a telescope, it's not very easy to see. You can't see that much because of our atmosphere. It sort of muddles things up. And in our first slide, we have a picture of Mars taken through a large telescope. And what are we seeing here, Phil?
Well, it's not a bad photograph as pictures go that have been taken from the Earth, but you can see a few dark markings there, and surrounding that are the reddish desert areas. At the top, at around the 11 o'clock position, you saw a small whitish spot, and that's a remnant of one of the polar caps on Mars. That's another similarity it has with our own planet.
Another similarity, too, offhand, is that their days are very much like Earth days. They're close to 24 hours.
That's right. I think if we went there right now and spent a day there, we probably wouldn't notice the difference in the day length. It's about a half-hour difference.
Well, you mentioned mythology. It's interesting in literature. You don't hear about the Earthlings being attacked by people from the planet Saturn, say. It's always the Martians, and I guess the first real science fiction writer about Mars was H.G. Wells. Could you tell us about him?
That's right. He lived in the latter part of the last century, and he wrote probably what is one of the first major works of science fiction, probably still the best work on Mars. It was a satirical approach, but he used the Martians to get his message across. I think we have a slide demonstrating the kinds of things he was talking about when the Martians did leave their own planet and came down here and invaded us. And at that time, they didn't have flying machines, so they used these tripod type configurations to get around and shoot up us Earthlings.
And again, this War of the Worlds, written by H.G. Wells, was also used by Orson Welles in the late 30s, and it panicked an entire continent, didn't it?
That's right. I think our parents, if they were tuned in, could probably tell us some hair-raising stories about how they were frightened out of their wits because they believed that we were being invaded. It was such a realistic production.
Well, one of the fascinating things about Mars around the turn of the century was the canals. And in the next slide, Phil, we have a drawing, an artist's depiction of a canal on Mars. Who thought up these canals in the first place? Where do they come from?
Well, again, the latter part of the last century, people were peering through their smallish-sized telescopes, trying to make out indistinct features on this distant world, and they thought that they saw these straight lines. Some people saw them, some didn't, and they let their imaginations run wild. They probably would have been good science fiction writers. But these were serious astronomers, and they thought that these straight lines may be canals to transport water from the polar areas to the desiccated equatorial regions, and the Martians were desperately trying to save their dying civilization.
So just from looking at a telescope and seeing some lines on Mars, they determined that these are canals to carry water to a civilization of which the only evidence is just lines on the surface.
That's right, and I think there's a lesson there. Don't jump to conclusions.
Yeah, really. Well, in that slide we saw a drawing of Mars and a canal, and maps were made, weren't they, of to show the entire surface of Mars laid out with these series of canals. I think in the next slide we can see that, and they even gave names to the canals, just like we give names to streets.
That's right. The names that have been applied to supposed features on Mars are very, very interesting. They're very romantic. They are themselves taken from mythology around the Mediterranean area on the Earth, and just reading down a list of these names brings to mind all sorts of amazing ideas. It's very interesting.
What other writers wrote about Mars in the early 1900s?
Well, one of the people that we don't think of as a science fiction writer was Edgar Rice Burroughs. He's better known for creating Tarzan of the Apes, but he also wrote about Mars, and his hero was John Carter. And this gentleman simply wished himself to Mars and had all sorts of amazing adventures with scantily clad maidens and princesses, and he was a very swashbuckling type.
Phil, you brought in some books, and it's interesting the way they've set up the drawings on the front to make them look very adventurous. And as you say, Edgar Rice Burroughs had quite an imagination.
Yes, we have several here. I guess more books have been written about Mars in the science fiction vein than almost any other. The first one I have here, written by Robert Heinlein, and of course, we have the requisite Martian monster on the cover. We have, what were at the time, I suppose, interesting means of traveling through the air. There weren't too much in the way of flight at the time. And again, another Martian monster, several arms there. And I guess this goes way back, and even today we have interesting creatures.
Well, back around the same time as Edgar Rice Burroughs and H.G. Wells, there was a very interesting astronomer living in Arizona, and his name was Percival Lowell. And Percival Lowell was very interested in the canals, but he was also, he predicted that Pluto existed. At that time, nobody knew if Pluto existed or not. And he really was interested in the canals, wasn't he? I think we have a slide of some of his work, if we could get that up.
Yes, this is a globe that he constructed, which is now in the Smithsonian. And he was a great force behind the exploration of Mars from the Earth. He was very lucky in that he was independently wealthy, so he constructed his own observatory. And he was one of the few people who claimed that he could see canals such as we see here on this globe.
In the next slide, Phil, we have a drawing of what we know of today as being a large canal-like object on Mars. It's just a drawing, and the next slide is of the Mariner Valley, and you can see that it looks very much like a canal. Of course, probably much bigger than they would have thought the Martians had built, but it does exist on Mars as we know it.
That's right. This particular valley can be seen very indistinctly from the Earth, and it was one of Percival Lowell's canals. He gave it a name, and it does exist, but essentially everything else he saw canal-wise was all in his head.
Well, what can we determine looking at Mars? What are the features that we can see, and can we find out anything apart from just making drawings?
It's very, very difficult because, as you mentioned, it is quite far away. It's much smaller than the Earth. With care, proper equipment, one can determine it has an atmosphere much thinner than ours. There's probably very little water there, things of that nature. But unless one goes there, it's difficult to make those kinds of determinations.
We said it's very much like Earth. We do know that Mars, too, has seasons. And in the next slide, we can look at Mars, again, through a telescope. And over time, Phil, the seasons do cause the features to change, don't they?
That's right. And this caused a great controversy in the early part of this century. In this picture, we can see what appear to be some greenish markings. Now, what on Earth, or possibly, I should say, what on Mars could they possibly be? And the theory was put forward that they may be vegetation, because as you mentioned, the seasons progress on Mars much as they do here, and these features will change. In the summer, they become greener, and as winter comes around, they fade and turn brown.
So the logical question is, are we looking at vegetation?
That's right, and many people thought, here we are. We don't have princesses, but maybe we have lichen. Boring, perhaps, but maybe lichen. Then in the 30s, a Canadian astronomer by the name of Peter Millman decided he should try and settle this question. And what he did was turn a telescope to Mars, and he attached an instrument called a spectroscope, which would analyze the light being reflected from that planet. And he was particularly interested in these greenish markings. He analyzed those markings, and he determined that they were not made up of chlorophyll, which all plants on Earth are, or all green plants. That seemed to put the skids on any idea of Martian vegetation. If it existed, it couldn't have chlorophyll, but odds are nothing alive there.
Well, the next step, of course, if you just have to look through a telescope, you're only limited to what you can see. But the next step was actually going to Mars. And in the early 60s, the first spacecraft went by Mars, sent out by the Americans and the Russians. I think in the first slide here, we have a picture of one of the earlier shots. And the big surprise, of course, was Mars has craters. Nobody knew that.
That's right. People were filled with expectations of all sorts of exotic things on Mars. But the first spacecraft simply flew by and photographed very, very little of the surface. We had photographs like this coming back, and there's a great disappointment. Mars looked more like the moon than anything else, a totally dead, airless world, and some people were crushed.
Well, let's start to talk about the Mars spacecraft, as we should call it. That is the Viking spacecraft, Vikings 1 and 2, which landed on Mars in 1976. What was the objective behind the Viking project?
Well, they wanted to get a couple of spacecraft down on the surface. There's nothing like actually being there to find out what's going on. They wanted to sample the soil, see what that was made out of, sample the atmosphere, see exactly what it was composed of, find out what the weather was like. But above all, we go back to the question of life. Is there life on Mars? And the Viking spacecraft were equipped to deal with that question.
Well, I think in the first slide here, we see the Viking insignia. And of course, 1976 was the year of Viking, and it was certainly an exciting time. They tried to make the first landing on July 4th, but unfortunately the landing site they chose, Phil, was too rocky. They had to choose a new one. But I guess, well, 16 days later, it was such an exciting time to hear about the Viking landing. Of course, the two spacecraft, too, in orbit, took a lot of pictures of the surface of Mars. In the next slide, we can see the orbiter above Mars and the Viking lander underneath. And it would come down like in a parachute, wouldn't it?
That's right. After it's separated from the mothership or the orbiter, the lander would penetrate the atmosphere and slowly come down through it by a parachute, and then at a certain distance above the ground, it would separate from the chute and land the rest of the way on its rockets.
In the next slide, we can see a picture of Mars as it looked when Viking was approaching it. And from the previous slides we've seen, boy, this is a much clearer picture of Mars than anything you can get from Earth.
It certainly is, and here we have an inkling of some of the exciting things that actually do exist on Mars. It's not like the moon. There are fascinating features on it. The dark circular objects we can see here are actually volcanoes, and Mars possibly has the largest volcanoes in the entire solar system.
I think in the next slide we have a close-up of one of those volcanoes, which they've given quite a romantic name, Olympus Mons.
That's right. Again, we go back to the romance of Mars, which is, I think, deeply ingrained in us. And this is a tremendously huge feature, something like 500 kilometers across at the base, with cliffs rising sheer into the Martian air from the plateau. It must be just a tremendous feature to be able to see.
Are those clouds, the white area there?
That's right. Clouds form in the air around these elevated features, and these can be seen from the Earth. Now, there are more interesting things we can see on Mars, as the next slide will show to us. And again, this was taken from one of the orbiters, a giant valley, Valles Marineris, which was discovered there. And it goes approximately a third of the way around the planet, or in Earth terms, from one coast of Canada to the other. The Grand Canyon, in comparison, is nothing.
The Grand Canyon would just fit into one of the little tributaries.
That's right. Drop it in and lose it.
In the next slide, we have more valleys on Mars, which comes to the question, well, if there's life, maybe there has to be water. And I think in the next slide, we see some valleys and low areas with more cloud.
Right. In the Martian night and early morning, you can see clouds and frost forming on the surface. This is partially due to carbon dioxide, which is being frozen out. But there is a little bit of water vapor there, and it may be forming in the atmosphere. The idea, though, is that most of it is probably in permafrost in the ground.
Well, if we're looking for water on Mars, we're going to want to look for a river valley. And I think in the next slide, anyone who was thinking that it will see, anyone who thought there might be water on Mars, when they saw this next slide, the immediate thought is, wow, that's a dried up river valley.
That's right. All those who were frustrated by the early pictures really got excited when they saw this. They couldn't find water now, but at some time there must have been water flowing on the planet and cut gorges, something like we see here, and they're all over the place.
Well, let's get to the exciting part. I'm really interested in the landers themselves. In the next slide, we have a drawing of what the lander looked like, and when we get that up, Phil, maybe you can describe the different parts of it to us.
Okay. What we see, first of all, on the right-hand side is a large dish with which the lander communicated with the Earth and with its mothership in orbit. And to the left, extreme left, we see the sampling arm with which the spacecraft would reach out and claw up samples of soil, which it would test on the onboard experiments. And there's also a couple of TV cameras we can see standing up vertically there. And those are the things that gave us some of our fantastic shots of the surface.
The interesting thing about landing on Mars is that when the Viking spacecraft was coming down, it was all computer controlled, because the time for the signal to go from Mars to Earth took 18 minutes. So by the time it had landed, we still didn't know it was down yet. And so they couldn't control it from Earth, steer it or anyway. It just came straight down, and fingers crossed it wouldn't land on any rocks or anything like that.
That's an amazing feat. It was totally pre-programmed before it ever left the Earth. And then once it started its descent, it was totally on its own.
Well, let's look at some slides from the planet Mars. I think our first slide is the first picture, and boy, were they scientists excited when they saw rocks.
That's right. The very first photograph from another planet in our solar system. This was very reassuring because the Russians had attempted a landing on Mars a number of times and had failed every time, and people were beginning to wonder if something funny was happening out there. We have some more interesting shots, as we'll see in the next slide. Color.
Wow, Mars is red.
That's right.
What a surprise.
That's right. We can see that it's red even from the Earth with the naked eye. And when you go there, again, it's red. And essentially, it's a rusty planet. All the oxygen that used to exist there has combined with the iron, and it's rusted out.
Just rusted away. In the next slide, they have a big rock that I think if the lander had landed on it, it would have been a goodbye lander. And the scientists have called it Big Joe. And that's the most impressive thing about the pictures. There's nothing but rocks.
That's right. It's a lot of volcanic rocks out there. There's some dune fields and some sand you can see blowing around. I think it's a good place for an all-terrain vehicle or a dune buggy.
Really, no, it's just a super. And of course, thousands and thousands of pictures came back of Mars from both Viking 1 and another spacecraft, Viking 2. And I think in the next picture, Phil, we'll see how we determined whether or not there was life on the planet. Could you tell us about that?
Okay, here we have the business end of the scoop. Now we would sample the soil and then essentially throw the soil over its shoulder into receptacles on board the spacecraft. And there were 3 biology experiments on board. They simply took a microbiology laboratory, shrunk it down into a cubic foot, which is an amazing feat in itself, sent it to Mars, and looked for life. And they ran a number of tests to see if there were anything out there that might be alive. They weren't looking for elephants or giraffes or dogs, anything like that, but something small, bacteria. So anything that was likely to be alive on Mars would probably be bacteria.
And what was the result of the experiments?
That's kind of up in the air, so to speak. They got some interesting results, which on the face of them would seem to indicate that, yes, there is something alive on Mars. Something is doing something to our experiments out there.
You mean just chemically? No one's going to throw the Viking lander around or anything like that?
No, nothing that big, fortunately, unless they landed on them. We can't see them, but that's unlikely.
Yeah.
these experiments were run a number of times, and some controls were run. I think the consensus is that no, there is nothing alive, at least where the spacecraft came down. People are still hoping, I think, for other locations, but nothing alive where the spacecraft actually came down. There are other experiments which would seem to back up that conclusion. But I guess the geologists are happy because the funny things the soil was doing would give them probably years of work and study, and they would love to get their hands on some of that material.
So the next logical step is a lander with wheels, so you can move around from site to site and get different soil samples.
That's right, and the technology for that kind of thing does exist because, again, the Russians did that kind of thing on the moon. They had a wheeled vehicle which simply roamed around.
The next slide is our pretty postcard from Mars shot showing a beautiful sunset on the planet Mars as Vikings saw it. Just a spectacular mission, and certainly there's nothing planned right now to land on Mars in the near future, but hopefully soon we'll get some money to go back there. An interesting aspect too, we could just for a few seconds talk about it, and that is a meteorite that was found in Antarctica. When just last year, when it was looked at closely, they determined that it was the same chemical makeup as Mars rocks. How could that be, Phil?
That's right. If you look at the Antarctic ice, there are a lot of rocks lying around, and they feel some of them are from the moon, and a few possibly from Mars, as you say, same chemical makeup. The problem is, though, how do you get it here from there? It's a lot of space in between, and any force that is likely to eject a rock from Mars would probably destroy it. So we're in a quandary. It seems to come from Mars, but nobody knows how it could possibly get here.
Well, Mars, too, like the Earth, has a moon, but it has two moons. It doesn't just have one. And the next slide is of, I believe, Phobos, which is the larger of Mars's two moons. And it doesn't look like a normal moon. It's sort of a lumpy moon.
That's right. It's very, very tiny. It's not very good as moons go, somewhere around 10 miles across. At one time, people speculated that the moons of Mars might actually be artificial satellites launched by, again, this dying Martian civilization. And it wasn't truly until we had photographed something like that up here that we knew that they were actually natural formations, perhaps captured asteroids.
Well, what about Mars this spring, this spring, Phil? What are we going to see in the sky, and how could someone see Mars if they wanted to?
Well, the interesting thing is that tonight any of our viewers could go out and look into the eastern sky after it gets dark, say around 11 o'clock, and you'll see some bright objects. There'll be some stars up in the sky, but there'll be a reddish one, a very bright reddish one. That's the planet Mars. And simply with the naked eye, one can observe and see what this planet is doing. I think we have a slide that will demonstrate the kind of motions that Mars, and for that matter the other planets, go through. These loops in the sky are what the planets are doing. They don't simply drift gracefully across the sky, but appear to form these loops as the relative motions of our planet and Mars zip past each other.
So I believe this was taken in a planetarium, but what we're saying is that the planets, over months, of course,
yes.
If you were to take a chart and watch them every day for several weeks, you'd see them take this loop-the-loop motion across the sky.
That's right. And if someone has a small telescope, again, there'd be a lot of things that they can see that we've talked about here today. The polar caps, for example, one can see those, and dust storms. There's a dust storm raging on Mars.
Oh, is that right?
Right now, that's right. And clouds, you can see those. It doesn't take a very big telescope to show the general outlines of these kinds of things that are happening there.
Phil, I want to thank you very much for coming by and talking to us about Mars today. It's been very interesting.
My pleasure.
We hope to have you back next time we have a lander on Mars or something about Mars to talk about.
Okay, thank you.
I'd like to thank you very much for watching today. Normally we end about here, but we have a few announcements tonight about the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada. The RASC has several centers across the country. The Toronto Centre is the largest, of which I am very proud to be president of at the moment. We have over 700 members, both amateur and professional members of the RASC, where we do a lot of interesting things, either getting together, looking at Mars, looking through telescopes, or attending very many lectures. My interest with the RASC is the public end, public education, and that is the reason for Astronomy Toronto. We look at several topics. This month, one of the more interesting things in the sky, and that is the planet Mars, something that we all may be interested in, but certainly something that we can all get out and take a look at. My next month's show will be seen the first Thursday in May, May 3rd, and the topic will be cosmology, where we'll be looking at where the universe came from, how was it formed, and where can we expect the universe to be going in the next few billion years. So if you're interested in making plans, that might be interesting for you to tune in. Again, Astronomy Toronto is seen the first Thursday of every month at 8 o'clock. And another interesting topic coming up in the next few months is an eclipse of the sun. On May 30th, the Toronto area will be seeing a partial eclipse of the sun. You might remember that the last eclipse of the sun was on February 26th, 1979. Toronto had a partial eclipse for that. In Winnipeg, it was total. Many members of the Toronto Centre went out to see it. But the partial eclipse, unfortunately, was clouded out back then. Well, there was a lot of questioning, a lot of concern, because eclipses are dangerous to look at if you're not prepared. Well, Astronomy Toronto is preparing a special show for the end of May so that people in Toronto will know how to safely look at the eclipse of the sun. That's something for you to look forward to also. On May 5th, there's the International Astronomy Day, and the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada, Toronto Centre members will be setting up telescopes in Nathan Phillips Square and at Harbourfront around noontime on Saturday, May 5th. And if you're interested in meeting people of the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada, please join us then, May 5th, around noon, Nathan Phillips Square and Harbourfront. Again, my name is Randy Attwood. I'm really glad you could join us today, and we'll see you next month. Bye-bye for now.